So let's say we have Google, and we wanted to do something like site colon, and then we put in something like msn.com. Now you notice that all the results here that we put in are MSN because we specified msn.com, or at least that's msn.com within there. So other things, let's say we wanted to do something like ASA 5505. And then we do something like expertsexchange.com, for instance. Now it's going to go out there and find any kind of ASA 5505 specifically at the expertexchange.com. So all of our results should indicate the expertexchange.com website, which you can see here is the case. And they all have to do with the 5505 ASA. So we can definitely specify things. Now also what we could do is we could go in and do something like a file type :PDF. So it'll go out there and search for anything that's PDF related on the expertexchange.com, which there is none. However, let's say if we just did .com with PDF, and you'll notice here now we get results of our ASA 5505 with the site of .com. So every result here is a .com, and the file type is always going to be, in this case, PDF. So you can see here we should have only PDFs as our options that we have. Plus it's a .com, rather it's Cisco.com or whatever else. So that's what we're specifying here. Now we do have other scenarios. What we could do, for instance, we can put something in here like in title : So now what it's going to do, and you notice here we jumped from a couple thousand to 935 results. But when it comes to in title, it basically allows us to narrow it down to what is in the title. So when I click on one of these, it's actually going to be in the title here. So as you can see here, the Cisco ASA 5505, that's in the title, right? The ASA 5505, because that's what we specified here in the title. Now we can also use other things like, let's say we want, instead of using site, we want to use something like in URL. All right, so we do in title ASA 5505, in URL. I don't know, let's put in Cisco, something like that. And we can also put in something like plus in text VPN or something like that, and see what we get back. And as you can see, we get a few results back, as in 14,300. But what we're basically seeing is we have in the title ASA 5505, kind of like what we had here. We have in the URL of Cisco, right? So somewhere in the URL, regardless of where, it needs to have Cisco in it, which it does. And then within the text itself, it should have VPNs. So as you can see here, we see the text and it's mentioning the VPN, right? So again, when we look at some of these things, we need to be able to identify, again, looking at things like in title, in URL, in text, site colon, the things like even the file type, things like that. Right, so you definitely can find out some of these things. A lot of times we're looking at things like, for instance, index of MP3 or something like that. All right, so we can check out specific things within that. So again, that's going to be pretty straightforward when it comes down to using some of the Google type stuff. We also have the ability, rather than just doing in title, doing things like all in title or all in URL, which basically restrict the results to those with all of the query words in the title, versus just using in title, which uses restricts the results to documents containing that word in the title. So if you wanted to be more specific, you can do all of the query words in the URL, which makes it again more specific, takes down your search results, things like that. So just keep in mind, as you're going out there and you're doing these things, that it might be a good idea to take a look at some of the results that you get by using some of these operators. Okay, now let's take a peek into domain name registration. Now the DNS server, your domain name server, basically is responsible for keeping track of what name you put in to where it goes on the IP address. So let's say if I go to my command prompt here and I do something like ping mile2.com. Now, all I know is mile2.com. However, because of DNS and the DNS settings, it's able to tell me, in this case too, what the IP address of mile2.com is. And this has to do with DNS records, which we'll talk about here shortly. It is also very important to look into and get a little bit of idea from what that looks like. So in our case here, when we pinged mile2.com, the DNS server knew that mile2.com was at this IP address of 206.214.216.216. All right. Now, rather than us remembering this number, we just need to remember the name. And that gets kept track of by DNS records, which we'll talk about here shortly. All right, when it comes to domain name registration, this information here, you can check out the Aaron.net, the appnik.net, and ripe.net, which basically covers North America, South America. We have Asia Pacific and Europe and so forth as well that's being covered. And these are basically holding the repositories for IP numbers that are going to be used. So we have Internet, which is a repository for name registration. And it has basically delegated to about 250 registrars, and you can check it out at the intranet.net alpha.html. So basically, when we pinged the mile2.com website, right, we have the domain name registration that was controlled by Aaron, for instance, that gave us a specific IP address that identified where we were, part of the world. Now here's some of the whois information that we can see. This basically, once we've actually registered for a domain name and so forth, and we've put our information in, hopefully we were very generic with putting the information in and did not put personal information in that would allow a hacker to do some social engineering attacks against us. But either way, when you go to, for instance, the centralops.net website, you can actually find out some of the additional information, which we'll show you here in just a moment. Now, Aaron's database contains information on networks, autonomous system numbers, as in ASN numbers, network-related handles, and other related points of contact. Do not search on domain names here. Search on other information such as IP address or organization name and such here. So now we get into the DNS databases. Now, they contain information about your fully qualified domain names and IP addresses. They also contain information such as which servers are the mail servers and Active Directory servers. What we basically have here, and there are a few others which I'll mention one or two more, but we basically have our record name. Record name of host, which is the record type of an A record. Now the A record generally just maps the domain name to an IP address. We have a pointer record, the PTR, which maps the IP address to a domain name. We have the name server, which basically gives us the information of the name of the server. A lot of times it's just going to be NS1, NS2 at whatever the domain name is .com or whatnot. And it identifies a server name for the delegated zone. We also have what's called the start of authority. Now the SOA record. This configures settings for zone transfers and record caching. And basically there's different things within the SOA, the start of authority, that you need to know. You need to look at the start of authority record and see what that looks like. Now it's basically broken down into the serial number, which is basically just a revision number, which also includes the date. We have the refresh rate, which is the refresh interval for secondary DNS servers. We have a retry, which is going to be the retry interval if zone transfers fail. We have the expire, which is how long until the secondary server will hold on to the record if it does not receive an update. And then we have, lastly, the TTL, which is the default TTL for the client name resolution. And as we look at the SOA record, you will notice that is going to be the order that it comes in. So you need to be able to identify something within there, within the SOA record. We also have the service locator, which is the SRV, used to locate services and servers on the network. And we also have the mail, as in your MX records. And the MX records are very important because they allow us to basically go in and do things like, if it's set up for mail relay, for instance, we can actually spam that mail server and use it as a spam server, more or less, because it has relay enabled. So anytime we see anything regarding SMTP servers, the possibility of you being able to use the command prompt, for instance, and telnetting into port 25, which is for SMTP, your Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, then that means we could possibly use it as a mail relay server, and with that, send emails unsolicited through that server. Pretty cool. Now there's one more here I want to mention, at least. It's called the HInfo record type, and its purpose is to identify services that are running, as well as the CPU and the operating system itself, and such. Then we also have a text record, and basically we personalize information there that could be put into the text record, and that should do it for us. So make sure you are able to identify any of the record types and what they look like. Check out the centralops.net website to take a look at some of those records and what the results would be for that. Now we get into some other things, such as using things like NSLOOKUP. Now keep in mind, NSLOOKUP is going to be used mainly on the Windows side of things, and it is used to query your domain name servers. The output information can then be used to diagnose your DNS issues. However, hackers can use NSLOOKUP output to determine what servers to target. Now, both Unix and Windows come with an NSLOOKUP client, and it is built into many tools. Remember, on the Unix side, it is called DIG. Now, when it comes down to it, we basically have what's called the traceroute operation. Now, traceroute is going to be used to determine the path taken from the attackers to the target. And this is going to be doing by exploiting the TTL, as in your time to live, to get the target. Now, we can use the traceroute command in the Unix world, Linux world, or we can use the tracert command within the Windows world. And basically it gives us the path to the destination, and we're able to then route and figure out how many hops, and then also figure out to go from there.